from China's perspective, they have a number of avenues that they can use to control significant portions of the world. One is the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement Organization (SCO), by which they have a certain amount of influence and to some extent some control over Central Asia, over some of the Central Asian nations. Obviously, China has very deep pockets, which is very attractive to nations in Central Asia. They can benefit from that. So one is SCO, the other is obviously BRICS, and BRICS is currently a very attractive option for many nations. I think more than 10, 12 nations have expressed their desire to join BRICS, including Saudi Arabia. I believe even Turkey has expressed a desire, Egypt, Indonesia also, Argentina in Latin America. So BRICS seems to be extremely attractive to a number of nations, global South nations. So that is something by which they can increase their influence and their reach. The other thing that is definitely happening is that now we are witnessing trade of oil and petrochemicals in a currency other than the dollar. We have the ruble yuan mechanism. When it comes to India and Russia, we have the rupee ruble mechanism. Dirhams are also involved in this. Saudi Arabia may also be willing to trade in a different currency, maybe the Chinese yuan. So there is a shift away from the US dollar. It's very incipient right now. It's not something that's far reaching, but we are witnessing a desire by many nations to do this. Even the Indonesian president recently, Mr. Joko Widodo, he said that we need to stop using Visa and MasterCard because it is controlled by the US, and that can be a significant problem for us. So many nations have witnessed the policies of the US when vis-a-vis Russia when it came to this war. Incredible amount of sanctions have been imposed on Russia. Russia has obviously been able to some extent tide it over, but other smaller nations will be very vulnerable. We've already seen what happened to Iran. So all of these things are coming together to some extent in BRICS, to a smaller extent in the SCO organization. And of course, Mr. Xi Jinping understands that if Russia, for whatever reason, fails in this current adventure, or whatever we want to call it, in Ukraine, then China will be left with a very hard choice. If Russia actually fails, if Mr. Putin fails, then essentially one could foresee the scenario that if Mr. Putin, for whatever reason, has failed, and if he fails, then the Russian politics is very, very, very hard. I mean, there is very little tolerance for failure. If Mr. Putin fails in the war, it means that he will most likely go out of power, and then you could have a pro-Russia regime that may emerge in Russia, a pro-US regime that may emerge in Russia, like in the 1990s, Mr. Yeltsin, and that could lead to the breakup of Russia. That is also a possibility. If that sort of far-fetched scenario actually happens, then Mr. Xi Jinping and China will be in a very hard position. So it makes sense for them to cooperate with Russia, and then they may have to turn to India because there may be no other bigger alternative. So lots of possibilities are open right now, but Russia and China would like to create a parallel world order, like you have been speaking about the Dragon Bear and all of what their agenda is. They would like to create a new world order, a parallel world order, and slowly push back against the so-called rules-based world order of the US. And this may be attractive to a lot of nations because we know the history. We know the history of Latin America. There have been in Central America, so many coups have been conducted in this region. The African continent is to some extent still being actively colonized by covert means by certain nations. So obviously there is a significant desire to be free of all of this. Indonesia also has a very, very rough history from the 1950s onwards. The coup against Mr. Sukarno, the placing of Mr. Suharto in his place, and the terrible events that happened after that. So there is a sense, I believe, in the global South to be free of the shadow and the influence and the power of certain Western nations. And because of this, it may be for them attractive for them to maybe align themselves to a certain extent, maybe completely or partially, with the Dragon Bear. So that's what's happening. And that is the great hope and dream of Mr. Xi Jinping, to lead this entire movement. Of course, the problem for Mr. Xi Jinping is that there is not a lot of trust when it comes to China. I mean, when it comes to the Southeast Asia region, the South China Sea region, every nation is feeling the heat of the Chinese naval force. They have the biggest naval force in the world now in terms of numbers. They are turning out warships and destroyers and frigates like sausages. That's how they're producing them. Submarines as well, and they have this dual use policy of their merchant fleet as well, which kind of doubles as the Chinese navy to a certain extent. So all these nations are feeling the heat. So for them, it's a tough choice. For the Philippines, it's a tough choice. For Indonesia, it's a tough choice. For Japan, it's a no-brainer actually, and Vietnam and so on. So yeah, that's the thing. So that great hope for Mr. Xi Jinping is to lead this thing and take China forward. But I am not sure how much is going to be possible, because the Chinese century, I would say, is no longer going to happen. China is no longer going to replace the US as the superpower. I do not see this happening anymore.